I have played Fate Grand Order every day for the past 2.5 years, and I have come to the conclusion, it's not that good. I have a lot to say about this game. This volume of the Atrocious Gacha Reviews will be much more personal to me, as I have a way longer playtime on this one than any of the previous entries I've reviewed. At the same time, FGO will also represent the largest audience of any gacha game I have covered so far, so I really want to dive into exactly what I will discuss. Before I get into the actual review, I want to preface this by saying that FGO was my second ever gacha game, one after Genshin. I started during New Year of 2022 and have been diligently logging in every day from that point onwards. I play as a low spender, but despite me playing the game for 2 years, I don't have the majority of the SSRs in my roster. In fact, I don't even have 50% of it. This is due to the game's extremely stingy rates, but I'll go over that in due time. I don't have in-depth experience with every single playstyle or team, and it's not feasible for me to ever reach that point as a low spender. I'm familiar with the Fate franchise, having watched Zero and Stay Night, so I know what the Holy Grail War refers to, I know about the most iconic characters, and I know what mana transfer means. In short, my relationship with the Fate franchise is pretty lukewarm. I wouldn't consider myself a dedicated Fate fan, but I'm familiar with it. I play on the North America servers, which is 2 years behind the Japanese one. This means I won't have all the hands-on experience for the content that is yet to be released, but I will consider JP content to the best of my knowledge. If you've been playing FGO for a long time, and when you saw the length of the video, I think you have a very good idea what I'll be talking about for the next hour and a half. I want to make it very clear that any of my critiques or opinions on the game is directed to the game and its developers, not to its community and content creators. Undoubtedly, there will be many longtime fans watching this video. In fact, you might be an FGO veteran or streamer reacting to this video right now. Well, if that's the case, you should thank me for the 2 hours of free content that I just provided, and if you're going to upload the reaction video in full without any significant edits onto YouTube, then please wait until this video reaches 3 weeks of age before uploading it. If this condition is not met, then dislike the reaction video, unsubscribe from the channel immediately, and also block the channel. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about Fate. It's one of the biggest franchises in Japan, and I think Western fans don't really have a good grasp of just how huge it is. During its peak, FGO had the highest number of entries at Comiket in Japan, and it's not even close between it and second place, though VTubers and Blue Archive seem to be dominating the list these days. It was more talked about than Fortnite and PUBG, and amassed hundreds of millions of dollars in the first 3 years of runtime. Fate is an absolute cultural phenomenon in Japan, so if there was a way to get the best of the franchise right at your fingertips, you bet a game like that is gonna garner a lot of attention. Unlike other IP-based gacha games, FGO actually expands on the lore of the series quite a lot, bringing in many new flavors to the franchise. For those that never played it, even now, FGO sits comfortably in the top 10 earners in terms of worldwide monthly revenue, which means it shouldn't be unfair to assume that the game is doing a lot of things right. Okay, so my expectations are sky high now. You are one of the best, right? I chose FGO because I heard the story was really good. In fact, this is my one weakness when it comes to choosing new gachas to play. For whatever reason, the gacha game industry is home to some of the best storytelling imaginable. If you say your game has a good story, I will play it. I went into it with an open mind. I knew how atrociously bad the gacha rates were, but I thought if I didn't focus on that, I just try to enjoy the story instead, there shouldn't be any problems. If you ask anyone what FGO is most known for, a lot of its emphasis is on the narrative and characters, primarily the design and illustrations. So if you point at a piece of FGO artwork and say, "That looks AI generated," that is one of the most offensive things you can say to this community. In the end, enjoy the story, I sure did, but I had no clue what I was walking into. So business as usual, I will start by doing a background check on the developers of the game I'm reviewing. FGO was developed by a small indie Japanese studio called Delightworks. It was later rebranded to Lasengle, who was later acquired by Aniplex in 2022, who now manages both the JP and the NA servers. To my understanding, Delightworks was a relatively unknown company that was contracted to develop a Fate mobile game alongside one of the original series' primary writers, Kinoku Nas, who assisted with writing the prologue chapter of the game and whose name also phonetically translates to mushroom eggplant. How this one company got the rights for the Fate IP, I have no idea. Nas, alongside Takashi Takeuchi as the illustrator, formed the visual novel company Type Moon, with their debuting visual novel Tsukihime, released in the year 2000. Fate Stay Night was their first commercially released visual novel in 2004, with a follow-up sequel in 2005. I've never seen it myself, but it was immensely popular at the time. Fate in general has grown into a long-standing franchise with multiple forms of media. There's a lot of cool stuff you can find if you look hard enough. They got some other works under their belt as well, but there's no denying that these two are industry veterans. They have influence regarding the direction of FGO narratively, with NOS taking the lead on writing the main story chapters. FGO was Delightworks' first major project, and I did some digging, but they're also the authors of 2 other games. In 2020, they also released a new gacha game called Sakura Kakume, which is based on the JRPG series Sakura Wars. Well, I'll probably cover this in more detail in a future video, but long story short, this game bombed hard. Huge loss on revenue and investment, it was shut down after 6 months. Looks like the popularity of the IP couldn't carry them this time. Guess the success of FGO must have gone to their head, and the terminated game is suspiciously missing on Lasengle's website. I know what you did, Delightworks, you can't hide from me. In 2021, they also announced an untitled new game, presumably also gacha, but the teaser site and the trailer have been taken down quietly sometime in 2022. The URL to the site gives an error and the video is privated. Well, since no one said that I'm not allowed to show it, and since someone in the comments conveniently archived it, here is the trailer for that untitled game. It basically shows a scene rendered in Unreal Engine 4, which is what it was advertised for. Then the screen pans to some imagery depicting some cyberbullying themes, the camera pans to some horror elements, then a cut to the teaser screen. No title, no release date. As for the site, it's no longer accessible. But I wonder if... No, it can't be that easy. So we can't see what the background was anymore, but essentially the game was detailed as a new project for Delightworks using a new engine. There really isn't much to go on except for the teaser page, which is pretty bare bones. But we can confirm the DW and Unreal Engine logo at the bottom. Who knows, maybe this project will resurface under Lasengle's authorship. Only time will tell. Overall, it's a company with few projects, but FGO's scale has expanded way beyond anyone's expectations. So, let's finally talk about it. FGO JP launched in August of 2015 and the NA server July in 2017. Well, when it first launched, the game wasn't in the prettiest shape. Obviously, the game engine had 9 years to be polished at this point, so the NA side didn't experience much of the bugs. But to the uninitiated FGO player, you might be wondering, damn, the UI for the game kinda looks outdated. Yes, that's exactly right. Even by 2015 standards, this didn't look too good. Pokémon Go released in the same year, and mobile game staples like Clash of Clans had already been released with more intuitive UI. There's a lot of general jank compared to other gacha games in terms of today's standards, but the UI will get its turn later in the video. The main thing to remember here is that the FGO project was not the most well thought out or the most well developed. It was originally created as a cash grab mobile game. The original launch had a risk of being shut down based on the number of bugs and optimization issues right then and there. I went back and took a look at the maintenance periods throughout the launch in 2015, and you can see just how often the game went down. In fact, there was a running joke among the JP players at the time known as the legendary 18 minutes, where the game was available to play for a whopping third of an hour. I think Delightworks deserves a pat on the back for that one. During its first Halloween event, there was a limited quest that only lasted for 1 hour. Everyone tried to log in, which overloaded the servers. This flimsily put together game engine will be the crux of a lot of FGO's problems down the line. Let's keep this in mind going forward. So since FGO often ranks in the top 10 and sometimes even top 5 of monthly gacha earners, it shouldn't be unreasonable to have high expectations for it, like in terms of production quality, gameplay, and update schedules. So in Fate Grand Order, you play as the Master of Chaldea, a novice rookie mage that happened to be at the right place at the right time, who is also canonically heavily implied as underage, despite what the doujins depict. Chaldea is part of a research foundation for magecraft. In 2015, the institution predicted that humanity will reach extinction 2 years later. In order to find the cause of this anomaly, Chaldea has conducted ray shifts into previous eras and found several singularities corrupting humanity's timeline. tasked with restoring the foundations of humanity by recovering 7 singularities formed by the omnipotent Holy Grails, the Master, alongside his or her Kohai, Mash Kyrielite, Da Vinci, who is a MILF in the Fate universe, Dr. Roman, Olga Mary, and Professor Lev. And you go on a grand mission to recover the Grails and delete these singularities, preventing humanity from extinction. Now, if I were to describe FGO's gameplay, it would look like an iceberg. On the surface, it looks deceptively simple, but there are so many hidden mechanics that the game doesn't tell you. At its absolute core, FGO features turn-based combat, where you will form a party of 3 servants, with 3 backline members that will replace the servants that perish on the front lines. Each servant is equipped with 3 skills that have cooldowns for a certain amount of specified turns. You will also select a friend support as one of the 6 options, but unlike in some other gachas, you have to select a support. Except for special cases, you cannot bring 6 of your own units into a level. The units you bring can also be equipped with an artifact item called Craft Essence, often abbreviated as CE. The rarity of the unit and CE contribute to the total cost of the party, with the higher rarities costing more. Even if you reach the higher player levels, you cannot bring a full party of 5-star units or CEs, so you do have to at least use a few units of lesser rarities, or just give up a slot entirely. Luckily, something else I quite like about FGO is that some of the low rarity units are actually pretty good, and a couple I still run in the late game. The typical team consists of 2 supports and 1 DPS on field, but this is not a hard requirement and you can basically run whatever. The backline members exist to replace downed servants, and the last slot, usually referred to as an anchor, is used by a strong solo unit with great survivability to close out the fight before you run out of steam. Each servant has 5 cards in a deck, and it consists of 3 card types. They will have access to their Noble Phantasm, so when the NP gauge is at 100% or above, the NP card can be selected during your turn as its own separate card. Each non-NP card, also referred to as a face card, can also crit, depending on the number of stars currency you have. 1 star equates to 10%, but since critting is an all-or-nothing mechanic, you're gonna have times where you hit a 10% chance and miss 90% ones. The 3 card types in the game are Buster, which does the most damage, generates a small amount of stars, and does not increase your MP gauge. Arts, which does medium damage, generates the most MP gauge and generates very little to no stars, and Quick, the weakest card type in terms of strength, generates the most stars and increases the NP gauge by a little. Each servant has a slightly different deck, so the 3 card types can be distributed a bit differently. During a turn, the game will select 5 cards at random, and you will choose 3 to use. Since there are 3 servants totaling 15 cards, they will cycle through every 3 turns, assuming you don't specifically use a deck shuffle effect. The 3 cards selected will have its effects modified depending on which ones you picked. The first card, often referred to as the lead card, will determine the effects of the subsequent 2. Buster will slightly increase the damage, Arts will slightly increase the NP gain, and Quick will increase the number of stars gained, and all cards will get a plus 20% crit chance. If all 3 cards selected are Buster cards, then the entire attack chain will increase its damage through something called the Buster chain. If all 3 are Arts, then any servant cards associated in the chain will gain a 20% NP gauge while increasing the gain itself, and if all 3 are Quick, then 20 stars are instantly generated, and all cards will get a plus 20% crit chance. If the chain contains 1 of each type, then you will get a small bonus of all 3, through something called the QAB chain or the Mighty chain. If the chain only contains cards from a single servant, they will perform an additional 4th attack at the end called a Brave chain. It's worth noting that you can combine a Brave chain with the other types, so you can do Buster Brave chains, Arts Brave chains, and onwards. It's also worth noting that even if a servant does not have 3 of the same card type in their deck, if their NP card can make up for the missing one, they can still perform a chain with it. Each NP can either deal damage or grant buffs or debuffs. There is also a unique overcharge ability for each. While the NP itself is usable at 100%, if you pull additional copies of the character, you can charge it to 200 or even 300. Overcharge level goes up to 5, and if the NP is used at 200% gauge, it will have a level 2 overcharge. You're not going to see a level 5 overcharge NP very often, but another type of attack chain is something called the NP chain, where if you place an NP right after another, then the subsequent one will increase 1 overcharge level. You can even chain 3 in a row, but if you split up the 2 NP cards like this, then it will not count as an NP chain, and no overcharge will happen. You can freely target an enemy before an attack is initiated, but there's no way to change the target for each individual attack card. If the enemy is defeated, then the game will auto-select the rightmost enemy for the next attack to hit. If you select 2 or more face cards belonging to the same servant, they will keep attacking the same target even if their health is 0. But the targeting priority is changed if you use an MP card or use another servant's face cards. So for example, if I use the Brave Chain here, then the servant would just keep hammering on the same enemy. But if I put their MP card in the middle, then the first attack kills the rightmost enemy, so since the NP counts as a different card type, then the third one and the extra attack will finish off the last on the left. The thing is, the game doesn't tell you this, it's just something that you have to figure out for yourself. There is also a class system with damage advantages, where a class will deal double damage and only take half damage to another. So for example, Sabers have advantage over Lancers, who beats Archers, who beats Sabers. The same loop exists for the 3 classes of Riders, Casters, and Assassins, and Berserkers dealing 1.5 times damage to all other classes while dealing double damage from them. Rulers deal neutral damage to all the aforementioned classes and only take 0.5 times damage back from them, except Berserkers, while also having full class advantage towards Moon Cancers, who beats Avengers, who beats Rulers. Foreigners have full class advantage towards Berserkers, meaning this is the only class where Berserkers will deal half damage too. Foreigners also deal and take double damage from other foreigners, and also have class advantage towards Pretenders. Now, Pretenders have half class advantage towards the Knight classes, or Sabers, Archers, and Lancers, where they deal 1.5 times damage towards them, but only dealing half damage for the Cavalry classes of Riders, Casters, and Assassins. But all of these classes will deal neutral damage back, and the Pretenders also have full class advantage towards Alter Egos, and these guys are the other way around. They deal 1.5 times damage to the Cavalry classes, but half to the Knight classes, and they loop right back to having full advantage towards Foreigners. There's also the elusive Shielder class, who takes and deals complete neutral damage to all classes. But there's only one Shielder in the entire game, and that is your Eggplant Kohai. It's basically a very elaborate game of rock, paper, scissors. That being said, since I've got a sizable amount of gacha games under my belt at this point, FGO's class system is the most extreme I've seen. Usually a class or element can deal a bit more extra damage to another, but dealing double damage while only taking half damage from an enemy is kind of a big deal. Even if a servant does special damage towards an enemy with a specific trait, why not just bring someone with full class advantage? Each servant also has a set of passive abilities, which are usually just small bonuses here and there, but some of the recent ones can get pretty creative. For each battle, you are also equipped with something called a Mystic Code, essentially just an outfit that gives 3 master skills for you to use. These can range from anything from healing a servant, switching the order of a backline member, or shuffling your deck. On the upper right corner, you can also carry up to 3 command spells. You can use them to heal a servant back to full, fill the MP gauge, or using all 3, literally bring your entire party back to life and fill their MP gauges. One is refreshed every day at server reset, though the 9th anniversary will refresh all 3 per day on JP now. If only Shiro had this ability in Stay Night. Now, I normally don't do a section for story content in these reviews, but since FGO is well known for it, representing a big part of its cultural significance and popularity, let's talk about it. So after the Fuyuki prologue chapter, Kinoku Nas was hands-off in writing the first couple singularities. To put it plainly, the first 5 chapters of the story, how do I describe it? Oh yeah, not so good. Because the game was originally created as a cash grab, the story was pretty much non-existent. Orleans was really just a fan service for John, one of the most popular Fate characters, and Septum was really just fan service for Nero Claudius, who has turned into a waifu in this universe. When they adapted FGO into anime, they only adapted the prologue and singularities 6, 7, and the finale. The story battles were not very creative either, and the difficulty is pretty much a joke. That is, until you actually get to the good part. They realized that despite all the game's shortcomings, the game was doing well. In an effort to increase player interest, they thought, wait a minute, people are actually playing this. Maybe we should actually write some good stories. The Camelot arc was the first to receive proper care from writers, with Nas coming back as the primary creative director. There was an infamous difficulty spike where this guy with the power of the sun stops you right in your tracks. Now, I often prefer games with a more gradual slope for difficulty, but as I mentioned in the Path to Nowhere review, I understand that some players actually like sudden difficulty spikes like this one, where it forces you to approach the game differently, and you can't just solve anything with your broken friend supports. Anyways, Camelot represented a major turning point in FGO's development. Alongside the next singularity, Babylonia, the game was able to reach the apex of its popularity in the 2016 and 2017 period. The world genuinely felt alive and the characters were fleshed out. The fights were no longer huge enemies with inflated health bars, and some bosses have some pretty interesting gimmicks. For the time, I didn't regret my decision to start this game at all. I mean, the story was scattered in bite-sized pieces, so I didn't have to commit too long when I was commuting to university at the time. I mean, the full party revives with the command spells makes it so that even if you don't care about pulling for meta units, you can still enjoy the story despite the difficult encounters. After Babylonia, it was time for the finale of the main story chapters. The Solomon raid of 2016 was arguably FGO at its peak. All masters were tasked with bringing down the 6 demon pillars in order to access the final boss and finish the story. It was an exciting era, and there was no better time to be playing FGO. And the final boss encounter, possibly one of the hardest for its time, was truly challenging and deserving of its hype. Or, you can just cheese it. Anyways, after the main arc concluded, there were also 4 filler chapters. These are just whatever. I like some of them, but ultimately these chapters are optional. And so, Arc 2 of the main story, known as Cosmos in the Lost Belt, where you're tasked with, again, solving 7 singularities where a tree of emptiness is corrupting that timeline. Teaming up with MASH, Sherlock Holmes, which I'm not sure how FGO got the license to use that name, since Ace Attorney had to change it to Herlock Sholmes. Gordov, the pompous new director, and also Da Vinci, who has turned into a lolly. Arc 2 is still ongoing to this day, even on the JP servers 7 years later. I think a lot of the aspects of storytelling and gameplay have improved in the second arc. The bosses have the break bar mechanic, where you can only deplete a maximum of 1 bar per turn, so you can't just stack every possible buff in existence and blow away the boss in a single turn. The designs are more intricate, where there's some encounters where you're actually up against another master. I know the events are scripted and it's really just sprites moving across the screen, but all these small touches really makes it feel like you're battling in the Fate universe. I think what something Arc 2 does really well is really encapsulating the feeling of hopelessness. You barely escape from Chaldea, you're in a foreign snowy region, and you don't know how close or how many the enemies are. One moment you're up against the ruler of China from the Qin dynasty, then you're trying to take down the Olympian gods. There are animated cutscenes now, and some of the Lost Belts, especially the later ones, are genuinely very well written. Lost Belt 6 represents such a bombshell that if someone argued it was the best story arc in a gacha game ever, I would not even contest it. On the JP side, the 7 Lost Belts have ended, but there was a new sub-arc called Ordeal Call that continues part 2. The basic takeaway is that FGO has some of the strongest story writing in gacha gaming, especially getting into the later chapters. It is very good. The only thing is that if you are interested in diving into the lore, there's no skip function to go straight to the Lost Belts. You have to slog through the early chapters first. We will talk about that later, but for now, let's start the critique. Strap in, this is a long one. For the remainder of the video, I will be giving the usual below, within, or above expectations rating for each section, starting with progression. I will critique FGO with the exact same metrics as any other gacha games I have reviewed. I do not care about any limitations with FGO's shoddy engine. If a common feature is not available based on 2024 standards, then I will simply say that it's missing that feature and that it's not up to my standards. It's up to Lasengle or Aniplex to address the problems that the game may have. I feel the need to clarify this because I know people will say that some of FGO's problems can be excused since the game engine is so old. I personally disagree. Since Aniplex makes so much money from this game, it should be a reasonable assumption that they do have the budget and the capability of addressing some of them. And it would be unfair to make an exception to FGO when the same standards were held to all the other games I've reviewed. The gameplay may be from another era, meaning the core loop cannot be changed, and that is fine. I actually think in terms of the UI's aesthetics, it's oddly old school and unique. FGO is a turn-based visual novel style gacha, and it should stay that way. There's a reason I don't judge the gameplay in my reviews. I can't simply say that an open world game is better than a visual novel. That would be comparing apples and oranges. No one wants to fundamentally change FGO into an open world or shooter game. When someone compares one of FGO's features to another game, what you need to understand is that they're not comparing the premise and genre of them. They are comparing the quality and standard when it comes to handling that feature, of what they, including myself, believe should be reasonable expectations. For example, developer feedback. How often does the development team respond to players and improve upon what's there? It doesn't matter what genre of game it is, developer responsiveness is universally important for building goodwill and trust of the player base. How about a crossplay feature? Players should be able to seamlessly carry their progress to another device and continue playing from there. Doesn't matter what genre of game it is. Crossplay is a standard modern feature in these mobile games. Not having it doesn't make FGO have its own unique identity. It makes it an inferior product. A review is ultimately an informed opinion. I will judge FGO based on my standards and expectations. You might have a different set of standards and disagree, and that is okay, but this is my review. So, progression in FGO. Let's talk about it. Using the time-gated currency called AP, you can use it to clear certain levels to gain certain upgrade materials or progress in the story. I should note it's one of those games where everything requires it. If you run out, you actually just can't do anything. Luckily, the game is quite generous with these apples that restore AP, but if you're a veteran, you'll know to save up these apples to farm certain events that have better drop rates. All servants can be ascended 4 times, and their default level cap depends on the rarity. 1 stars have a cap of level 60, 2 stars at 65, 3 stars at 70, 4 stars at 80, and 5 stars at 90. This means low rarity units get shafted pretty hard here since their stats are gonna be gimped. The majority of the low rarities considered good are either ones that give supportive buffs, taunters, or just kill themselves off so a better unit can take their place. For 3 of the Ascensions, you also unlock a new appearance for the servants' in-game sprites. And again, you can see that low rarities get gimped here since most of them just add an extra article of clothing while the SSRs change their sprites completely. Leveling servants uses an item called Ember, which is farmable via one of the daily nodes. Except unlike a common currency like any other gacha game, Embers physically take up a slot in your inventory. While this is usually not an issue most of the time, it's just a hassle to micromanage it, since all other gachas I played just have leveling materials as a currency. Speaking of which, FGO does have QP as its common gold currency for pretty much any types of upgrades. This is again farmed via one of the daily nodes. The numerous other upgrade materials are either farmed via a free quest in the game world or purchased from the shop, usually during events. Most will argue that it's best to hold out until an event sells them, since it's typically not so AP efficient if you do farm it manually and drops are not guaranteed, so you can literally run through the level multiple times just to get nothing. There is a separate type of upgrade cards called F.O.M.O, which you can feed to a servant to permanently raise their base stats. You can feed up to 1000 points of F.O.M.O for HP and attack respectively. You can raise it for another 1000 with gold F.O.M.O, which is given out a bit more infrequently. When leveling skills, the cooldown of the skill is decreased by 1 turn whenever the skill hits level 6 and 10, which is the maximum, and I don't believe there has been an exception to this rule. Craft essences can also be leveled and limit broken, lower rarities having a lower cap than the higher ones. These can give either HP or attack or a combination of both. You can level them by using other CEs or specific XP CEs. If you pull multiple copies of a unit, you can upgrade their NP level, which increases the damage, assuming that it actually does damage, or the potency of any buffs or debuffs. The NP level can go up to a maximum of 5, but the biggest change will be from NP level 1 to 2, which grants the most amount of damage increase, while the later ones slowly give diminishing returns. NP levels will also increase the default overcharge limit so that you can raise your NP gauge above 100%. Since some low rarities are pretty good too, you can basically just imagine this as a freebie. Each of a servant's 5 cards can also be equipped with a command code. They are essentially small boosts whenever that card is used, like generating stars or NP, afflicting a status effect, and so on. Command codes can be obtained via clearing certain event quests, some of them pulled on the friend point gacha too. Most of the time, these are small upgrades to your characters, but there are a couple units that can benefit a lot from these, such as Robin Hood, who deals more damage to targets afflicted with poison. A servant's command cards can be strengthened by using an item called Beast's Footprint. You can get one of these every 7 days of login. I mostly forget this thing even exists, but in case a certain card is used by that unit a lot, you can put upgrades into this. You can increase the max level cap of a servant to 100 using Holy Grails, which increases by 5 levels when used before level 90 and 2 levels after that. You can level to the absolute maximum of level 120, but it takes an absurd amount of resources and another currency called servant coins belonging to that respective servant. Now here's a new type of upgrade that not everyone was pleased with. With the introduction of servant coins, you can also unlock something called append skills for each unit. Essentially just 3 new passive abilities to enhance them even more. Like starting each encounter with their MP gauge partially filled. These can be leveled to 10, same as normal skills, except you get servant coins by increasing their bond level or by pulling additional copies. As it currently stands, you actually can't get enough coins to unlock everything unless you pull additional copies above the maximum amount of MP levels for 4 and 5 stars. This wasn't a very popular move since the game essentially increased the level of grind you have to do for each servant without actually offering any kind of new significant content. You're not forced to do it by any means, but you'll have to live with the fact that what used to be the theoretical maximum now has its bar raised, and your beloved level 100 servant is no longer performing at their absolute best. Lastly, there are bond levels, which functionally doesn't change much gameplay-wise, but unlocks new voice lines in the menu. At bond level 10, you get a unique bond CE for that servant, but this is widely debated as a questionable mechanic since the stats on that CE is fixed and gimped to provide less bonuses than a normal CE. The majority of them are not used, but there are some that are pretty good. An easy solution is to just add the effects of the CE as an additional passive ability, but that would actually require work from Lasengle's end. You can increase the bond past level 10, but doing so requires a Lantern of Galdead, which is given out rather infrequently. These are the ways you can beef up servants. When you complete daily quests and through other means, you get a currency called Mana Prisms, which can be spent in the monthly shop rotation for resources. When you pull an additional copy of a servant that is max limit broken, that is also a 4 or 5 star, you get units of Rare Prism. Normally, free-to-plays won't get a lot of these, but they occasionally give a few during events and campaigns. You can also set a friend support list for other players to use, equipped with their own CEs. When someone uses your servants, you get friend points or FP, which can be used to pull on the FP gacha. We will go over that in due time though. Now, progression at FGO can be a bit weird. If we exclude the daily farming nodes for Embers or QP, the ideal way to gain these resources efficiently is by just waiting for specific events that have better drop rates, such as raids or lotto events. Now this is fine, except this game is primordial and there's no quick farm or sweep function. You could painstakingly do each level the normal way, but there is a better method. From community efforts, you can do something called 3-turn farming, where if you have a compatible damage dealer and a meta support, and if you bring another meta support from your front list, the idea is that since buffs last 3 turns and there are usually 3 waves of enemies, if there's a way to use a damage dealing NP every turn for 3 turns, you could beat the level with minimum effort and clear time. As of now, there are multiple ways to achieve this, with each of the 3 card types, though quick is a little bit scuffed. You'll have to wait until one of these meta supports go on rate up, but getting one of them can make your life significantly easier. Even with 3-turn farming, because you're generally going to use your AP apples for these events, it's still going to take quite a while to tap away and use up all of it. And you technically don't have to do this, but because the value of these raids and lotto events are so huge, this is what the community would generally advise you to do for progression. Since NA is 2 years behind JP, you can literally predict which events will come out at roughly what time and prepare for them. Progression is the least of FGO's concerns. I know there's some quality of life features missing, like auto farm or fusion mechanics to craft certain materials, but the grind is pretty par for the course for a gacha game. It gets a within expectations rating from me. In terms of progression alone, I think it's fine, but the idea for waiting for specific events to progress faster is admittedly quite unique in the gacha space, but I don't think it's deserving of a failing grade. Okay, so that last portion you just heard there was the original version of the script. However, now that the 9th anniversary announcements have come out, an egregious thing they did was adding 2 new append skills. One that increases the crit damage, and another that literally reduces the cooldown of a unit's skills for 1 time. This is actually kind of a big deal. From my 2 years of playing, I never really gave it that much thought, since 1 copy of an SSR is enough to unlock 1 append skill, and typically it wouldn't be that big of a bonus anyways, and I was willing to give it a pass. Now though, this has changed. If we assume that no changes are made to the servant coin system, this makes it so that if you want to max out a servant, you literally have to pull multiple copies of them to do so. I understand there's usually a way for players to limit break units in a gacha game for more power, but this is too much. Not only are the limit breaks more desirable than before, you have to spend more resources and time grinding away at it. I will touch on the 9th anniversary announcements again near the end of the video. I was originally going to bump down the rating, but given they were able to respond to the situation by allowing you to transfer an append skill in place of another, it's at least something. I don't know if any changes will come to the servant coin system. It hasn't done so for the past 2 years. I'll stick with the original rating, but just know this is teetering very close. Gacha and monetization. Here we go. FGO is infamously known for its brutal gacha system. Even long-term players will nod their heads and agree, saying, yeah, we know, it's hell. But just how bad is it? Well, aside from the friend point gacha, where 1 and 2 stars come from, FGO has had the almost iconic 1% 5-star drop chance, and a 3% for 4 stars. You roll using the gacha currency Saint Quartz, and each pull costs 3 units, with a free pull for every 10th time you roll on it. See, at its launch, if you looked at the cash shop to buy quartz with real money, it actually gave you a lesser amount versus what we have now. Even as of current time, this quartz top-up shop is the only place you can spend money on the game. There's no daily deals or flash sales that may tempt you. This is also the only gacha game reviewed so far that does not have a 30-day welcome or battle pass system. Whether you think it's out of goodwill or out of incompetence for not knowing how to monetize their game, what lies is a fact that if you do spend money on the game, you have to do it here. In other words, you know exactly what you're doing. As for the SSR rate up, there is a 0.8% chance to drop, or 80% of the 1% overall chance. But this actually used to be only 0.7% in the past, and the free 11th pull didn't exist. For the rate up SR, there is a 1.5% or 50-50 coin flip of it being the rate up, but this has increased to 2.1% as of the 7th anniversary. After 330 pulls, if you still have not received the rate up SSR, you are guaranteed to pull it. If you're wondering why it's 330, that's due to the 11th free pull after 30 multis, or the equivalence of 900 SQ. What's more, the pity is disabled when you pull the first copy of the rate up, and it does not carry over to the next banners. I'm just gonna straight out say it. This is a laughable excuse of a pity system. Okay, so this is a last-minute addition, but as of the announcements of the 9th anniversary, the pity system still doesn't carry over across banners, but it's no longer disabled after 1 trigger. It's still 900 quartz for the limit, so baby steps, am I right? See, there's a popular saying in the player base: you don't choose the servant chooses you. A couple years ago, this pity system actually didn't even exist. If you are not able to pull the rate up, then you better keep trying until you do. Not only that, it was common for a rate up banner to feature multiple 4-star characters, and the rate up would rotate on a daily basis or every 2 days. Players would roll on the banner when their desired 4-star was on rate up, since the chance to pull it is 1.5%, half of the 3%. But when the pity was introduced, banners now split the rate up chance for 2 4-star servants, meaning the individual rates to pull either is now split even more. I look at the many forums where players weren't able to pull 1 copy of their desired unit even after months of saving and spending an obscene amount of money. And I just thought to myself, this is literally just a PNG file. You're spending hundreds of dollars for this? Now, I've seen some pretty brain-dead takes on this matter, saying that FGO's rates are fair and generous. You know what I say in response? Bullshit. A non-transferable pity that gets disabled after 1 use and requires 300 pulls to activate. Ask yourself this: is this really acceptable in 2024? Nikkei has the Spark system where you can hang on to these mileage tickets for as many and for as long as you want, traded for 200 per rate-up character. Limbus Company's top-up packs are so generous that the $1 pack can buy you 10 daily pulls with the first top-up bonus. In Reverse 1999, after an SSR goes on an initial banner for 3 patches, they're added to the permanent pool, so Tooth Fairy released in 1.2 will be able to spook you from 1.5 and onwards. I myself have a set of standards when it comes to how a gacha system is handled. There's a reason FGO is the butt of every joke when it comes to this. Well, the rates are bad, but at least it's not as bad as FGO. That quartz count better read 900, or else you ain't guaranteeing anything. Despite all of this, FGO has one of the most dedicated and committed fanbases I've seen. During its peak in 2017-ish, FGO was leading the top charts in terms of revenue. So even without a pity system, watching people throwing away their money at this game is unimaginable to see. When your live chat literally tells you to stop pulling and pay rent instead, maybe it really is time to stop. This is when gacha games were relatively underground, but while you hear about the rise of loot boxes or grinding battle passes, FGO went completely under the radar by major Western news outlets. Despite this game has insane retention of its existing player base. Like a sad case of Stockholm Syndrome, there is a sizable section of players that no matter how poorly the game treats them, they will keep playing, and they will keep coming back like cockroaches. I've seen players announce that they will save up for the next 2 years, then go all in on one servant that they saw on the Japanese servers. That is true dedication. It should be made clear that not getting what you want after diligently saving up for months feels absolutely disheartening. It feels like the game is not respecting your time and dedication. In today's gacha scene, a pity is the one trump card that you have as a player. It's the safety net to catch you in case you get screwed by bad RNG, and in my opinion, is considered a standard to have. I've stated this in a previous video, but if a gacha game I review does not have a pity system, then it's an instant failing grade for this section. The pity is the light at the end of the tunnel. No matter how atrocious your luck is, you can at least see the finishing line in the distance. Because if it doesn't exist, then aren't you just gambling? I know reaching 330 pulls without the rate up is unlikely, but the chance of it is not zero. I know this because it's actually happened to me once. It's like a creeping sense of anxiety that you know that you can throw hundreds if not thousands of dollars at the game and it will refuse you to give you what you want. It has happened before, and it will keep happening. Going back and looking at some of the forums years back really makes me want to ask, but damn, are you okay? But then again, before I start pointing fingers at people accusing them of having gambling problems, part of the blame does lie with you. You kinda chose to buy into this system, so in a way, if you believe this game isn't respecting your time and money, yet you keep playing it, that's on you. If I catch you topping up the most expensive quartz pack and you're rolling without a pity system, then I'm still gonna go, damn, you just gambled away 80 bucks. When I saw my same quartz count go from 1400 to 500, I thought to myself, what if something like this happens again? What if I save up to, let's say, 800 quartz, go for my next target, and then they just don't show up? How would I feel about the hundreds of resources that I piled up? How would I feel about the billions of QP that I have and nowhere to spend it? It's not the same as having a mileage system where the pity is retained. If you want to maximize the chances of your desired targets, you can't even try to dip into other banners. I also want to talk about the exclusivity of some servants. The majority of the shiny 5 stars are limited, meaning you have to wait until a rerun of them to have a chance of obtaining them. There are a couple here and there that are added to the standard pool, and there's also the weird story-locked servants, where they can drop as part of the story banner, which is permanently available, except they are blended in with the standard pool as well. So even if you waste your quartz rolling on this banner and get a 5 star, you are not guaranteed to get a story-locked servant. You could just get spooked by a permanent servant instead. What is even the point of this banner? I haven't even talked about the 4 stars because FGO has a lot of them too, and at times, even 3 stars locked behind limited banners. This game is home to some of the most diverse and well-designed characters, both in terms of aesthetic and gameplay. I think it's such a shame that these stingy rates make getting most of them extremely inaccessible. For the record, in case I forget later, there is an item called the Unregistered Spirit Origin, or USO for short, where you can exchange 10 of them for a on-rate-up character. How do you get USOs? That's the neat part. You don't. Only if you pull an additional copy of a 5 star that you have already max limit broken can you actually get one. Due to the stingy nature of the gacha system, only mega whales will be able to take advantage of this mechanic. Even if you gave a free USO for every player, it would be completely useless for like 95% of them. In terms of other types of monetization, as stated before, there is no such thing as a 30-day supply or battle pass. FGO came out before the craze of battle passes in the 2017 period, but I don't see how they can't implement one now, since if there was a good way for low spenders to dip into better resources, I would actually consider paying for it. The only valid way, or I guess 2 ways, is to buy the paid Saint Quartz for the daily paid pull, which is 66% off but requiring a paid SQ instead. The other way is the special banners that occur twice a year known as the GSSR or Guaranteed SSR. These banners will include a predetermined pool of limited servants, and you are guaranteed to draw at least one of them at random. These banners can only be pulled on once, and they occur at New Year and Anniversary. They cost 15 paid quartz to participate in. 15 paid same quartz will cost around $15, minus some uneven purchases with the packs. In the context of gacha games, $15 for a guaranteed limited SSR is a steal. You're basically robbing Aniplex blind. Much of the player base will agree that pulling on the GSSR is a very good idea for a low spender. This year in NA, they brought an additional type of GSSR called Destiny Order Summon 1 year early. By spending 30 paid quartz, you may select a roster of 5-star characters, one from each class, in which one of them will be summoned at random. The community loved this change. Look at the generosity of Lasengle, allowing us to spend more of our money to build our own GSSR roster. So there's a couple things I want to bring up with this. The GSSRs, including the Destiny Summon one, are considered massively valuable deals. But consider why they're thought of this way in the first place. These deals feel like heaven when compared to attempting to pull one of them manually. The gacha game developer has full control over the rates and the exclusivity of its characters. The majority of 5-stars in the game are limited, when combined with the laughable pity system makes them quite rare to get. This is a problem that the game itself has invented. And the GSSR and the Destiny Summon banners? Well, that's something I like to call create the problem, sell the solution. When you take a look at the generosity of other gacha devs, such as in Nikkei, where when you use even free gems to pull a certain amount of times during the New Year banner, it will give you an SSR selector that lets you get a copy of any non-limited character. Because the vast majority of units enter the standard pool immediately, you could choose from about 90% of the entire roster. This selector could be obtained by using free gems. So don't come in here and argue that FGO has a generous or fair gacha system, because when compared to the larger gacha space, this is not an argument that you can win. Something else I noticed is that if you go into the gacha menu of any gacha game, you can preview the kits of the unit, but that doesn't seem to be the case in FGO. So here's a question for you. Let's say I am a new player. I see that there is a rate-up banner on the 5-star character John Alter, or often abbreviated as Jolter in the community. Let's say that I'm interested in the design of this character, but I want to know what her entire kit looks like, including passives, skills, and append skills, so that I can make an informed decision whether or not I want to commit some pulls. The question is, how do I do that? See, on the gacha screen, there's no tab or info page that reveals Jolter's kit, only a page explaining the rates. There's none of that in the news section that goes over each rate-up character except for what their noble phantasm does. So how do I get that information then? Because in all the gachas I've played at this point, the entire kit is outlined in the gacha page for you to view, including their stats and skills. I am grasping at straws here, but maybe if I go into the servant roster, I can maybe pull up Jolter's kit. Except you can't see the profile of a servant that you don't own. The only feasible way to see it is by going into the friend list, find someone that has Jolter, then tap and hold on it to see the profile. See, whenever a new servant gets announced on the JP server, they showcase their NP animation, and they show what it does on a stream, but they don't actually show their full kit. Only when players pull that character can that information be added to the wiki. So here's my challenge to you. When the next servant releases on JP, make a servant guide on that unit, but you can only use information given in-game. No looking anything up on a third-party wiki. That's what I thought. You of course will want all the information you can on a unit before making the decision to pull for them or not. If you are making a guide, you of course will want other people to know all the information about a servant before recommending them to pull or not. It is truly baffling that information crucial to how a character works is not displayed in-game. I'll even show an example. Earlier this year, FGO did a collab with Mahoyo, a visual novel franchise belonging to the same Type Moon universe. There was a 5-star character called Kuonji Alice. So if I go into the official FGO JP website and look for the news announcement regarding the banner and the servant details, theoretically I should be able to get all the information I need, right? Okay, let's scroll down. Alright, so here we can see Alice's max HP and attack stats, we can see what her NP does, and even a link to an animation. But where are the skills? What about the passives? What about the append skills? It should be reasonable to expect that information from the official site, right? Because if you can't, don't you find it a little odd that you can't actually see what you're potentially spending real money for? Here's Reverse 1999, another turn-based visual novel gacha that allows for 3 actions per turn. If we click on the magnifying glass on the rate of SSR, we can see their full deck, the upgrades, the Ascension passive, the raw stats, and even their limit break buffs, including the full numbers of what gets upgraded by how much. Clicking on the 4 stars, oh look, we get the exact same thing. Some gachas even let you take the character for a test drive. I know there's a few cases where FGO does put out a test trial for a new servant, like the anniversary or the New Year ones, but why not just put one out there for every character that goes on a banner? There's a few lines I want to draw that a gacha game should never cross. One of them is that the game should make it very clear what your money is buying you. I think the fact that you literally have to look up the information on an external site to get the full details is, in my opinion, a little shady. So with all these components in mind, it's only natural that I give a below expectations rating for this section. However, I do want to give a few suggestions on how the system can improve, no matter how slim the chances they'll get implemented are. First, the pity will carry over across banners, and will have its pity decreased to 220 pulls, with the equivalent of 600 sane quartz as opposed to 900. The 200 pulls mileage is quite common these days, and even then, this is still on the stingier side given most gachas are below this limit for pity anyways. Third, after a certain amount of time has elapsed, a 5 or 4 star will move to the standard pool. This is something again getting quite common in gacha games these days. Cause I think it's such a shame because FGO has a lot of cool designs for servants, even for the lower rarities. Some of them are definitely showing their age, and I'm sure a lot of players would appreciate classics like Cleopatra or Gilgamesh becoming summonable as part of the permanent pool. The wait time can be like a year. Lasengle can keep their collab units and their favorites as truly limited, but after a year, most SSRs will be able to spook you. Get rid of the story-locked mechanic. Why does this even exist? You're not guaranteed a story-locked servant when you pull on the banner, so if you wanted a specific one, you would have to wait until that character goes on rate up anyways. Or alternatively, just give players a different type of summoning tickets for this banner exclusively, so they don't waste their resources on the story banner, like 5 freebie monthly pulls for it. So yeah, FGO Gacha, very infamous. To sum it up briefly, that's hell you're walking into. Next up, presentation. For the record, I do not judge gacha games for 2 primary aspects, gameplay and story, well, technically music too. Gameplay and music are both pretty subjective. As long as there's nothing glaringly wrong with it, then I don't have a problem. The story, well, I don't think a gacha game needs to have a good story to be a good game, like how people play Epic 7 for the PvP. Story is second priority. This section on presentation mainly covers the technicalities of the visuals, the UI, the smoothness of the player experience, and so on. Let's start with the framework that FGO was built on. Because of the initial cash grab nature of the game, the engine was hastily strung together and was slowly patched over time. Many of the UI and quality of life elements feel so outdated and so out of touch with modern standards, one might wonder why not just port it to a new engine. I used to play an online card game called Gwent, back when the game was still alive. There was a major update called Homecoming that completely revamped almost every aspect of the game. CD Projekt Red ported everyone's progress to a new game and continued development from there. Of course, the main gameplay loop was kept intact, but its framework for supporting the game was improved upon. I just gotta wonder, what's stopping Lasengle or Aniplex from doing the same? The game consistently performs on the top charts, so budget is definitely not an issue. Once again, I need to reiterate that it is up to the developers to address any issues with optimization and any technicalities. I cannot give any exceptions to FGO, simply because it wouldn't be fair to the other games I've reviewed on the channel. So the story of FGO is presented in a visual novel format, but for whatever reason, they never bothered to make more than 2 lines of dialogue show up at a time, so you have to be very selective on how the words are read since you can't scroll up unless you bring up the backlog to see what was said. It's weird because they have figured out how to do scalable text in some of the dialogue choices. There's absolutely no live 2D animation here, and parts of it can be forgiven since it wasn't so huge back then. Plus, I'm sure someone can argue that live 2D goes against the spirit of FGO and ruins the original artwork. Another thing is that the original game engine was built for those older generations of phones where the display were less wide, and when it was time to port it over to the newer displays in the 2017-ish models, it took them like a year or so to migrate the display. Before that, you could still download the game, but it would have an ugly looking border around it like this. When the display was ported over, the sprites retained their resolution, so if we blow it up on a big screen, it gets pretty pixelated. There's also no voice acting, despite the amount of revenue that gets pulled from this. It's really a shame because some of the story moments are really good, and I think a lot of Fate fans would love to see these scenes come to life with voice performances. I guess they can save the budget for the anime adaptations, but as of currently, none of the Lost Belts have been adapted to anime yet. I know it's possible to add it since some scenes, including the Valentine stories with each servant, are fully voice acted. Unlike a silent visual novel, you can't really argue that it's more immersive to imagine what the different servants sound like since they already do have voices. But hey, small indie company, am I right? Now, I've been an avid visual novel enjoyer for quite some time. I understand the importance of writing clear and concise words, but also being very flowery with it. I have no doubt that Kino Kunas is a very skilled writer. A lot of the story is extremely captivating, filled with well-established characters and lore, not to mention the faithful localization to English. I ultimately don't have any problems with it, but I can't help but think that it could have been more. For example, let's compare this to Reverse 1999, which also does a visual novel style of storytelling. Not only is the main story and event stories fully voice-acted, the character sprites are expressive and detailed, beautifully animated in live 2D and rendered cutscenes. The effort put into presenting something in a stylistic and unique way does take skill and talent. On a servant's profile, there are 3 different Ascension art, plus a special illustration for the 4th and final Ascension. However, it's quite clear that the newer and shinier 5 stars get the special treatment here, as their portrait arts change more dramatically, whereas the low rarities just kinda add a few details here and there. Technically, each servant comes with 3 skins, and for the newer units, they even have different sets of voice lines depending on which Ascension skin is applied. Something else I quite like when gacha games do this is special interactions between characters. When you level up the bond level of a servant, tapping on them in the lounge menu can sometimes trigger a line of dialogue regarding another servant if you have them in your roster. I like this. This is a very nice touch. It showcases that Chaldea is alive and the servants physically know each other, instead of only interacting with the player, making them the center of the universe. The music is also pretty good. I wouldn't say the game is known for it, but it's there. Though I wish there was a way to change the lobby music. There are skins that get introduced, but they are not paywalled. You trade for it using in-game materials and some QP. You cannot pay money for a skin in this game. Some give unique voice lines, but some are just small changes to the character sprites, which is still better than nothing. So that's the pleasantries out of the way, because for the next 10 minutes or so, I will be critiquing FGO's UI system. Typically in a gacha game, when you want to upgrade a character, you go to the character menu. You select the character you want, then you make all the upgrades from there. In FGO though, this is a bit different. There's a tab called Spirit Origins where you can see your roster, but bringing up a servant's details page, you can't actually do any upgrades from here. Even long tapping on the skills button doesn't bring you to the page. There is a separate tab that you have to go to instead called Enhance, where you have to individually decide if you want to level up a servant, the skills, the CEs, command codes, limit breaks, and grailing. Why do all these menus exist instead of a central area to do all of them? I don't know. We'll start from the top of the pile here. When leveling a servant or CE, you'll need embers or other CEs that act as XP. As mentioned previously, you have to physically select which embers to use, as some give more XP than others, and you can't use more than 20 at once. You then have to watch a cutscene of the embers being used, and even if you skip it, you have to watch the level gauge go up and the servant saying their level up line. I would really appreciate a way to skip this entirely since the majority of gacha games these days don't have this problem. The quick select feature is there if you want to automatically filter and select embers, except this feature is not there for CEs. It's not so bad if you're just leveling a unit normally, but when you need a lot of embers for grailing, it's mind-numbingly tedious.
Oh, that's real nice.
Now onto skills. When FGO was at its infancy stages, the skill descriptions were relatively simple, except 9 years later, servant kits have become a bit more complicated. Due to the spaghetti code, the game cannot change the skill description when it's level, and there's no way to implement keywords or side menus to absorb the text, making some of them extremely cluttered and unintuitive. For example, if you take a look at Calamity Jane's skill here, yeah, the skill itself is pretty interesting. It basically does things depending on the number of crit stars you have, making you build a crit or stars-oriented team. Except, players are greeted with a giant wall of text. Usually, when games introduce complex mechanics, they use keywords or bolded text to strip down on the information and make it easy to digest. Due to the shoestring engine of FGO, this is not possible. Let's take a look at an infamous skill called Imperial Privilege. If we take a look on what the skill actually upgrades, the in-game text will simply say that there is a chance to trigger an attack or defense buff and a healing effect. Okay, so what is the chance? The level does go up, but nothing about the description changes. So my question is, what is being upgraded, and by how much? How is a new player supposed to know which skills to prioritize? And I can already hear the veteran FGO players shouting at their screens, "Use the wiki, it's not a big deal." And my response is, do you really think it's up to modern gaming standards to hide critical information from players and ask them to look it up on a wiki? If we take a look at what this actually upgrades, there is a base 60% chance for either the attack or defense buff to proc, and the amount actually caps out at 44% each. This would have been very nice to know in-game, such as those skills that increase the NP gauge, sometimes known as battery skills. It doesn't actually show how much of it gets filled, so again, you literally have to look it up. This is quite frustrating since if I knew how much of the gauge would get filled up, my plays might have been different. Part of me wants to say that it's a game engine limitation, but they are able to show the numbers on append skills. Something else FGO does is traits, but this can get a little confusing because there are actually 3 types of these. There is alignment, which is kind of like the moral standings of a certain character, such as lawful good, neutral balance, or chaotic evil. The alignment of a servant is displayed in the profile section in the menu. There are also attributes, and all servants will be assigned 1. They're either man, earth, sky, star, or beast. In fact, there are actually hidden attribute advantages, but they're generally not considered since the change is so little. Attributes are not to be confused with traits, which are things that describe the character, such as humanoid, super large, divine, and so on. There are a number of skills or NPs that specifically target one of these niches, like Ashia Doman's ability to buff chaotic evil allies, or David dealing more damage to enemies with the giant trait since, you know, David and Goliath. It makes sense from a lore perspective and it's a cool concept. My only question is, here's an enemy on the field. How do I check what traits they have? What about servants? It does show their alignment chart in the profile, but what about their other traits? Summer Brynhilder has a skill that grants buffs to allies with the trait Loved Ones. Okay, what is that? Can I see a servant has that in the roster? How would I know which allies to bring if I don't know if they have this trait? Internally, this trait is known as Brynhilder's Beloved, and it is tagged onto a handful of servants. Okay, so if I see that Bedivere here is tagged with it, then how would I know in-game that he has the trait? It doesn't list it anywhere on the profile page. What about Berserker Ku Hulain? His profile has the alignment of chaotic evil, vastly different than Bedivere's lawful good. The alter ego Okita Alter has the Loved One trait, but the summer version does not. Let's take a look at another trait. The servant Gilgamesh has the special damage modifier to servants, as the game suggests, with the exclusion of those with the power of the star. The idea here is that as the King of Heroes, he has access to the Vault of Babylon, being able to recreate the powers and weapons of every servant in the existence. So naturally, one can assume that when up against another servant enemy, aside from those with the star attribute, Gilgamesh's NP will do more damage. Okay, so if I bring up the list of the star attribute servants, can I assume that this roster is immune to Anima Elish? Again, I need to bring up the wiki for this since you can't actually see a servant's attributes in-game. And before you comment this, I'm already 2 steps ahead of you because I know that this new year on JP 2024, there was an update to include the attributes of a servant in its profile, making the in-game descriptions more accurate. It only took them 8 years, and this change will grace the NA servers surely in 2026. To answer the previous question, no, not all the star attribute servants are immune. In fact, there is a special list of characters with immunity instead. Most of them are star attribute, but there are also some wildly inconsistent cases. For example, Romulus, the hero that founded the Roman Empire, is immune, but the Lancer version, Romulus Quirinus, is not. Regardless of the explanations, because I'm sure a Fate fan can confirmation bias their way out of this one, the issue here is that except for the vague term power of the stars, there's no way to confirm in-game if a servant is immune to this. So when you're out in the game planning out a stage, you can't just tap on the enemy's portraits to see their traits. You have to exit the game app, check the enemy lineup on a wiki and say, oh, this enemy has a certain trait, let me bring the appropriate attacker. How much does this charge up my NP gauge again? Alright, I gotta look this one up too. Oh, okay, so I got enough to MP this turn so I can actually make this play. Oh wait, does that soldier have the human or humanoid trait? Does that Treant have the giant or the super large trait? It doesn't take a genius to figure out, this is not a good player experience. You can have a lot of traits in the game, that's totally fine, but some of the times it's vague and misleading. For example, for the human and humanoid traits, as mentioned previously, encompasses those that are humans, and those that look human respectively. However, the human trait is only reserved for those enemies that are actually humans, but there are no servants in the game with that trait. Meanwhile, humanoid includes the vast majority of servants and a much wider array of enemies, and you can easily argue that all humans are also humanoid. Now look, the trait system is cool, like you can expand out to a lot of niches and for team building and character designs. The issue here is that the game does not give you enough information on the intricacies of them, and unless you, again, look it up on an external wiki, you can't get a full grasp of the system. Let's take a look at the in-game UI now. When you chain together your cards, there will be a display below to let you know of the effects of the chain. So if you use arts as the lead card, then every subsequent card will have a NP gain effect. So, if I was a new player learning the ropes, if I tried chaining together a buster chain like this with the NP card as the third and final one, my question is, since the lead card is a buster card and the chain itself is a buster chain, then it's expected that the last card in the chain will get a significant damage boost. In fact, I expect the NP to do different amounts of damage if it was placed on the front or back side of the chain. Regardless of what the correct answer may be, if I try chaining it like this, the game's UI will tell me that the NP will get an attack ++. So as a beginner, it shouldn't be unreasonable to assume that that's what it does, right? Here's something else. If you select a lead card of a certain type, all your other cards will softly glow in the type's respective color, just to indicate the bonuses that the first card provides. So if you tap on a buster card, all your cards will glow red, hinting that they will receive the effects of the first card, giving a slight attack up. And the same applies to quick or arts. But here's something interesting. If you try to lead with a certain card type, even the NP cards will glow in that color. So again, if I was a new player and I see that my Buster NP is glowing blue since I have an Arts lead card, it would be expected that since I'm leading with Arts, then the Buster NP will also have an NP gain effect, right? No, that's not how it works. NP cards work a bit differently from face cards. They are not affected by the first card bonus. They can generally be used as the lead card themselves, but there's obviously going to be some nuances here where you could place it further down. In this case specifically, using it in a chain like this will not increase that servant's NP meter. The game UI is misleading you with false information. In case you're wondering, this is still happening on the JP servers 9 years later. When I see stuff like this, I gotta ask Lasengle and Aniplex, what are you doing? How is something like this still in the game? There's no reason for the game to indicate it will do something but not actually do that thing. When you enter each level, it will expend the respective amount of AP points. Of course, this is nothing new in gacha games, except if you lose or decide to quit out, the AP is still expended. So if you accidentally tapped on a Narrow instead of your usual caster friend support, or didn't know how difficult the encounter could be, from the perspective of FGL, that sounds like a you problem. Typically in other gachas, the resource is refunded back to you whenever you lose or quit out of a level. This is a quality of life change I think is much needed here, as it feels quite punishing for the player when it's something out of their control, considering that pretty much all other gacha games have this safeguard in place. The front point gacha is where you go to roll your low rarity units. Usually in the late game, this is just for getting fodder to upgrade your units for CEs. However, during certain events, there is a limited time servant that gets added to the FP pool. It is generally advised by veterans to accumulate your FP and wait for these events, as pulling them grants you a lot of servant coins, which is then used to perform something called grail casting, enabling you to exchange servant coins for holy grails. It's a small thing you can optimize. The only issue is that it takes ages to spend all your FP. You can only roll 10 at a time, so you have to sit there clicking away until your hundreds of thousands of FP are all used up. And not to mention micromanaging your inventory, since you could quickly exceed the cap for servants and CEs. I wish there was a way to roll the FP gacha in bulk, kinda like what they did for lottery events, which would be an appreciated feature. Quick play or an auto battle feature is also quite common in modern gacha games. If you already beaten a level once and the game knows that you can do it, you can skip the level and get the rewards immediately. This is not present in FGO. The best way to farm is to use the 3-turn farming methods, which is optimized for time and brain usage. Getting one of those meta supports is not a hard requirement, but not having one will majorly inconvenience you. That being said, when certain events hit, they are generally considered better to grind since the material drops are more worth it, such as raids and lottery events. Even with 3-turn farming, it takes a grueling amount of time to clear out your stamina reserves. Some people are obviously going to be okay with it, but after some time, one has to wonder, is this really worth it? In titles such as Nikkei or Brown Dust 2, you can literally just expand all your AP at the press of a button. Here we have 60 units of your daily resources. Alright, auto battle this for me and we're done. See how easy that was? Nobody looks at a full AP meter and thinks, hell yeah, let's go farm embers again. It's a daily chore, so letting players skip it cuts down on the tedium, which again makes for a better player experience. Here, I'll even fix it for you while staying true to FGO's traditions. First, if the player quits out or fails a level, any AP or command spells they use are refunded. They are only to be used when the level is actually cleared. To my understanding, some of the Lost Belt 7 bosses did actually refund you your AP back, so I know this is possible. Second, since 3-turn farming has been part of FGO's cultural identity, instead of implementing a sweep or autoplay function, what they can do instead is to let you spend AP on bulk and give you the respective amount of rewards. So if a farming node costs 40 AP to enter, you can spend 120, triple the amount to clear once, then get triple the amount of rewards. Now we've solved the tedium of farming while staying true to the FGO spirit. And now, I'm going to utter a word so vile it will make you retract in terror. Saying this word will strike fear into even the most die-hard FGO fan. And that word is crossplay.
What the hell is that?
Crossplay, or cross-platform play, is a standard feature of gacha games that lets you play on multiple devices. Maybe I want to do the action-intensive activities with a keyboard and mouse, then log in on my phone before sleeping to spend my stamina. Maybe I want to enjoy the main story on a large screen so the small-ass mobile display doesn't burn my eyes, then log in on my phone to do dailies at night. Now, I understand that not all gacha games have an official PC port, and that's okay. What matters is that it lets you retain your progression across all platforms simply because, again, it's a good player experience. Maybe it's server reset time and I do my Nikkei dailies on my phone. Then I realize that the daily interception boss requires the fluidity of a keyboard and mouse. I close the game, open up the PC client, no need for any passwords, no need for any logins, tap to play and go from there. This has been the case with all 6 of the previous games I've reviewed and any other gacha games I've played in the past. This is exactly how it should work. Nothing more, nothing less. Instead, FGO uses the primordial technique of transfer codes, where you set a password and enter it to transfer your data to a new device. This means you cannot seamlessly play on a phone or tablet without issuing a code first. If for whatever reason the app is deleted or you lost your phone, you can either try contacting their customer support, then they'll ask you a bunch of personal questions relating to your account, then you just might get your account back, but if you don't, then you literally just lose all your progress. This is a major quit moment for even long-term players. There is nothing more disheartening than finding out that the investments you made on an account were all for nothing. What's more frustrating, just like every other technical issue I've mentioned so far, this is a fixable problem. And listen, I can already smell the doubters because I already know about the Aniplex email system introduced in JP earlier this year. This is actually not a crossplay system. It just makes it easier to transfer your data across devices. Not to mention that you need to verify yourself as a Japanese citizen. you still have to delete the data on your old device and keep signing in back and forth. It's an improved account binding system, not a crossplay system. I guess if you're on insane copium, you could just keep transferring your data back and forth across devices, but it is still a far cry from a true crossplay system widespread in gacha games these days. FGO's story is home to some of the greatest moments in gacha gaming. Some of the boss encounters are genuinely filled with unique mechanics, distinct animations, and visually appealing backdrops. So my question is, why not give players a chance to experience it again? There is a story cutscenes replay, but you can't actually fight the bosses. I'm sure a lot of players will want to relive the moments of facing against the Temple of Solomon, Knight Gawain from Camelot, or the monstrous Trees of Emptiness from the Lost Belt. It just strikes me a little odd that FGO is widely known for its beautiful storytelling, yet there is no way to experience any of those cool moments again. Except for certain recollection quests, but if you're able to show that this feature is possible, why not just put it there permanently? FGO is also home to a diverse array of farmable materials, all of which are needed for leveling servant skills. You can either farm them manually from a free quest node, which are usually not optimal for the drop rate, or via certain events. Some of these resources are only available in the later chapters, so if a new player gets a shiny new SSR from the Lost Belts, they actually just can't level them unless they reach that chapter. There is a currency called the Pure Prism that all players will get, but the supply is limited. In the Pure Prism shop, you can buy almost every material in the game, but again, there is a limit on how many can be bought. This is a good quality of life change, except certain skills are extremely grindy. If we take a look at Melusine's skill level up materials, one level up to 9 will cost 72 bells, meaning that you have to farm, just a tiny 216 of these. When compared to the total Pure Prism stock only at 100, it's not nearly enough to max out one servant's skills. Something frustrating is that FGO does not have a fusion function. In other gacha games, you can merge or combine lesser materials to a higher rarity one, to balance out any excessive materials and turn it into something useful. That would be pretty helpful here, wouldn't it? In Path to Nowhere, when you rate a level for resources, if you happen to get enough, the game will literally ask you if you want to continue or head back to save stamina. It's a streamlined process that cuts down on the tedium, making FGO pretty behind on this regard as well. There's also some general jank with the ways how the sorting or the filtering system works. You can kinda search through all your servants to find the right one, but there's all these options that I don't even know if anyone has the time and patience to use. There is a smart sort, where selecting certain servants or CEs can prioritize them at the front of the list, except this feature is really unintuitive what it actually does, since it has to be enabled via something called smart sort, except the toggle on the side says multi-select. Due to the sheer amount of servants and CEs added throughout the years, I think FGO could really benefit from a search function, in order to find the odd unit that you want, instead of sifting through all these menus. I'm glad that they did at least do some improvements here, so if you knew what to look for, it could get the job done. Let's say I'm in the burn menu, and I wish to burn all of my 1 and 2 star servants that I pulled on the FP gacha. By default, the sorting is unintuitive, and you would have to manually select the servants. It does get the results I wanted, but this can be confusing if you have a lot of servants to burn all at once, not to mention that the game does not auto-select them for you, and it's possible that you could make a mistake if you're not careful. Let's take a look at Brown Dust 2. Say I wanted to dismantle all of my R rarity gear that's tiers 1 and 2. Quite a long menu to sift through, but if you tap on the filters, you tap on R rarity, tiers 1 and 2. And the game will auto-select every applicable one, which you can just dismantle right then and there. Not only is this way easier, I know the game is not going to make a mistake. Now, you might be wondering, well, if the game's got all these problems, why did you stick around? So at the time, I didn't really give it too much thought. I was still commuting in college, and was just happily tapping away at the story on the metro. I think for a lot of longtime players, it's something that you just get used to. That is, until I started to dabble in other gacha games and realized, wait a minute, why isn't this feature in the game? It's there everywhere else, so why don't they have it? That's just the thing. The game makes millions of dollars, sometimes even on the level of Genshin Impact. So if you have this much budget to work with, where are all the improvements to meet the standards of modern gacha games? It just seems so bizarre to me that this cash cow of a game doesn't get key quality of life changes to this day. Since the optimization and technicalities are pretty far behind, presentation gets a below expectations rating. It's time to put your diverse servants to the test. Let's see how well FGO handles late-game challenge content. my metric for this section generally depends on how frequent and how plentiful are there ways for late game players to challenge their roster. How I tend to standardize this is by looking at the trend of modern games. I'm expecting to see some endgame dungeons that rotate on a bi-weekly basis, such as Genshin's Spiral Abyss, Nikkei's Solo and Union raids, Reverse 1999's Limbo mode, Brown Dust 2's Evil Castle mode, and so on. I don't believe gacha games should have a big emphasis on late game content, considering the casual nature of them, but it should still have something to reward those that have established accounts to take on a greater challenge. So historically, FGO has some pretty difficult story fights. I won't consider these as late games since they're available to be played at any time. Plus, the game gives you quite a lot of revive items, so even if you don't care about the challenge, you can just use them to enjoy the story. For every event, there is also a challenge quest, often abbreviated as CQ, that has you pitted against a difficult encounter. It's arguable that you don't have to do this, but considering that the reward for the first time clear is a crystallized lore, which is one of the rarest upgrade materials in the game, so it's highly advisable that you do clear it at least once. Historically, for the first 5 years or so, FGO's events will run for 2 weeks each, which was the standard for most gacha games. But now they have been extended to 3 weeks, meaning the frequency of CQs have been broadened. Outside of this, there are the occasional advanced quests that I actually quite like, as these are permanent and some of them test your abilities to make some weird and niche teams. I wish more of these came out frequently, since I really don't think they take much effort to do. So, FGO is home to some of the most uniquely designed characters. They tend to lean into their different niches, and solving the puzzle of a challenge quest feels very satisfying if you do pull it off. If you manage to get around the jank of the menus and the UI, you can have a lot of fun in these quests. That being said, I think it's quite a shame because a lot of the cooler designs are locked by ways of limited 4 and 5 stars. Now, I would love to explore all the quirky and unique playstyles if I had more of these servants, but due to the game's stingy gacha economy, if you're a free-to-play or low spender, you really have to be selective of who you want, as you simply just don't have the freedom to realistically target most servants that release. For the record, I don't consider grinding as part of late game content, but just so you know, if you're playing FGO for the long haul, you're going to be doing a lot of farming. If you don't own any of the meta supports that allow 3-turn farming, then it is going to be quite a lot more difficult and tedious to farm for materials. I personally don't find farming fun, since I think it's a tedium that could be resolved by the developers putting in features in place to make it easier. But I know some people simply do enjoy the grind. I think when there is challenge content, I'm generally okay with the designs and the substances of them. Some of the gimmicks and mechanics are pretty cool. I only wish they did them more often. If you really wanted to, you can just skip them or use your revive command spells. I'm willing to give FGO a pass on this one, but it's teetering very close. Late game content gets a within expectations rating from me. I think the main issue is the content schedule, which I will talk about later, as late game challenges should ideally be a routine thing that happens every couple weeks, and not tied to an event. When judging fear of missing out elements, I believe that a player should be able to jump in at any time without feeling that they've missed out on something. Additionally, older content should be rerun and periodically be made available to let players revisit them. FGO in this regard gets a disadvantage compared to previous review entries since it has been running for 9 years and we can see more of its track record. Let's establish what is actually limited in the game. Well, aside from the exclusivity of limited servants talked about earlier, some events will contain a welfare and/or event CE for you to pick up. The value here is pretty good, as some welfares are actually quite powerful. The same goes for the event CEs, and you even get a free MP5 copy. If you were not able to snag them when they were live, you would either have to wait for a rerun or via the upcoming Invocation Festival system, which will allow you to reclaim past welfares as they are released. This is actually pretty nice. Even if an event is rerun, if you already have the welfare servant from the first run, then you get copies of rare prisms instead. Pretty generous for those that have been playing for long. Events historically do get rerun once, but after that they're either added as a main interlude so you can play them at any time, or in some cases not rerun at all. This is something I have a grudge with in live service games, since some events have important lore implications that newer players wouldn't know that they existed. There's also skins or outfits. The majority of them are added to a separate shop menu where you can buy it with prisms, and again, all skins in this game are free, so you don't have to pay anything except in-game resources. Some outfits offer more than others, but hey, could FGO be doing more to mitigate FOMO? Yes, but I think it's far from the worst I've seen. Overall, they've been handling this in a fairly acceptable way. This section gets it within expectations from me as well. Lastly, we will talk about variety and content frequency. How often does the game receive meaningful updates? How about developer responsiveness? This section primarily takes a look at how well the game is maintained for the long term, including ways to shake up the gameplay loop for more variety. Once again, FGO gets a bit disadvantaged since we can see more of their track record, but at the same time, if this is done well, that would also speak about the quality of the game. Let's see how events and update schedules are handled in FGO. For the first 5 years of the game, normal events ran for 2 weeks, with the more major events like Summer running for 3 instead. This, in my opinion, should be the standard for gacha games. The majority of content patches, if you look at the wider spectrum of the market today, all have 2-week events, then a brief maintenance period before the next one arrives. There should be very minimal or no downtime where nothing is happening. This has changed in the last 2 years in FGO. All events containing a story mode are now 3 weeks. Normally, I would be fine with this. If you're putting out 3-week events, then you better also put out 3 weeks worth of content. But this has not been the case. The length and the amount of side activities in these events have remained the same, but the events are grindier than before, taking up more event currency before clearing out the points ladder or the shop. What they have effectively done is artificially prolonging each event period without providing significant new content. It's weird because some people will argue that Lasengle is being generous because they give players more time to go through the event, but that is going to be a hard disagree from me. I think they're being lazy. Event duration has nothing to do with grind or runtime, but to do with exclusivity. The game gets to dictate the level of grind that players have to do. Cut down on the amount players have to farm, and naturally people will spend less time with these tedious things. The event story also doesn't have to be exclusive to the duration of the event itself. What's stopping them from just adding it to an archive so players can experience them at any time? Like what Nikke does. Nikke doesn't have to do event reruns because it doesn't have this problem. It's funny because if any other gacha dev tried the same thing, then the community will suddenly start asking questions like, is the game okay? Why are events being extended? End of service soon? FGO makes tons of money from the game. Everyone knows that it's not shutting down. Yet why are they falling behind in terms of content scheduling when they have been doing this for the first 5 years of the game? I know they can make fun and engaging events. Here are 2 that I found very memorable during my time playing. In 2022, I was able to catch the rerun of Summer 4, the one where you go to Las Vegas. You got the famous Japanese painter Hokusai, who has been turned into an anime waifu, the fearsome swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, who has been turned into American, but also an anime waifu. There are also all these mini-stories with servants running their own casinos. The fights were fun and plentiful. This was a good event. It ran for 3 weeks, but it was worth it. The Grail concert event following mysterious heroine X as the first foreigner welfare unit, as she competes with other idol groups. You got all these cool new idol skins for the servants, there were unique music tracks that played whenever one of the featured servants was present. It was a lighthearted story, but I could clearly tell they put effort into it. Again, this was a good event. Another gripe I have with FGO is that event main story is often time-gated. Did you only have 1 day to play but want to go through the entire story in one go? Well, sorry, because you better wait until the next server reset or after you've grinded a little. Aside from the 3-week events, something else I want to bring up is the content schedule for the past 2 years. FGO is known for its characters and story. I don't think anyone will argue that. If that's the case, then these are the 2 aspects of the game they cannot mess up on. Last year in the summer, Lost Belt 6 released, and it genuinely shocked me how good it was. Reading through Avalon Lefay, I was willing to forgive any poor scheduling the game had. I think at the end of the day, we often forget that these gacha games we play are free to download. So it's kinda hard to grasp that I'm critiquing free games so deeply. I got to enjoy a story this good for free? That's unbelievable. It's really something you have to see for yourself, but Lost Belt 6 had such endearing characters, such an epic plot that as I finished it, I thought to myself, oh yeah, that's why I started playing FGO. That's why I was able to forgive its other shortcomings. So when I eventually completed Lost Belt 6, I was like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted. I want more of this. So like, when's the next main story chapter coming out? The gap between Lost Belt 6 and 7 was an astounding 16 months on the Japanese servers. Aside from the interlude chapters, which are, by the way, good in their own right, I don't consider them as main story chapters. This means FGO has only had 1 main story chapter every year. Looking at their 9 years track record, that is a record slow pace. Even on the JP side, Arc 2.5, dubbed Ordeal Call, some even refer to as Ordeal Stall, is only on Chapter 2, with the latest having released a bit earlier this year. Now, Lost Belt 7 at the time was also considered very good in its writing, but the journey for its release was not the smoothest. Let's look into this. The last core of Lost Belt 6 was released in August 2021. The campaign leading up to the 7th and final Lost Belt, dubbed Road to 7, was in place for almost a year. Eventually, the release date for Lost Belt 7 will be announced for Christmas of 2022. 16 months of waiting is a long time for anyone. But hey, it's the final arc of the Part 2 saga, so I guess ending it on Christmas is a pretty fitting way to close out the story. However, Lost Belt 7 will be released in multiple cores, with the second half releasing in the following January instead. Now, this is fine since Lost Belt 6 did the same thing. The issue was that there's no definite release date given. The earliest announcement was slated for the second half of January, but that's pretty vague. This could be anything between the 16th to the 31st. Even then, that's fine. As long as they gave players things to do, there shouldn't be any problems. Except, other than the New Year celebration campaign, there were 0 events happening for the entire month of January. There were 4 weeks of dead air. They couldn't put out a Grailfront minigame, no event reruns, not even a hunting quest campaign. And when news finally came out, people found out that there was a delay. The second part of Lost Belt 7 would finally release on January 31st, on the very last day of that month. Alright, well, at the very least, we have a date now, but we're not done with Lasengle's shenanigans. In the last 2 weeks leading to January 31st, they announced a new gacha banner for a brand new character, Nidacris Alter. Well, who is Nidacris Alter? As it turns out, she is a character that is involved with Lost Belt 7's story arc. The only problem is that Nidacris Alter had not even appeared in the story yet. This banner ran from January 18th to February 1st. This means Lasengle had just spoiled everyone. Now, I know some people will be quick to point this out, but this isn't the first time that a character involved in the main story was announced prior to the story's release. The issue here is that Nidacris Alter's release window was only 2 weeks away from the actual story. How had it not been a better alternative to wait until the second core releases on the 31st has had a chance to meet Nidacris in the story, then you put out the banner? You want to know why I think they did this? I'll tell you. Lasengle reports to Aniplex as the publisher, and as a corporation, they are obligated to generate monthly revenue reports for the game. Now, since January was a dead month with no events or reruns happening, it makes sense to put out a desirable gacha banner. However, since the story was delayed until the very last day, they decided to run the Nidacris banner 2 weeks early, in order to inflate those January revenue numbers, despite her not being even shown in the story yet. It sounds to me that this is a company that is willing to jeopardize their creative freedom so long as they could line their pockets with some extra cash. That's what I think of this situation. Putting out a gacha banner is easy. Putting out actual significant content in an orderly schedule is hard. I know this may seem like I'm picking on FGO here, but the vast majority of the time whenever something needs to be delayed or the scheduling needs to be adjusted, this is well communicated to players ahead of time. By today's standards, it is very rare to see reputable gacha games have extended amounts of dead periods without any events running or last-minute delays. During an interview, Kano Yoshiki, the director for the Lost Belt arcs, said that the game will be overhauling its bond system in order to address the shortcomings of how bond CEs work in this game, and that it was a good idea to have as many servants at bond 10 as you can, and that more news regarding the overhaul will be announced later. This interview was 2 years ago. A common sentiment I hear is, well, quality takes time, you can't just rush things. Now listen, for the record, I don't have a problem if the main story chapters take a long time to release. The issue here is that writing for a live service game is different from writing for a single player one. Nasu doesn't need to do all the stories. What matters is that the game is padded out with consistent and meaningful events with little to no dead air in between. Bring back 2-week events, just like how it was for the first 5 years of the game, reduce the grind, and make more side content. You are a multi-million-dollar franchise, so act like one. Now I want to talk about player appreciation and responsiveness. On the NA servers during the Tunguska Sanctuary event in December 2023, there was an Ivan the Terrible raid boss scheduled. However, due to an error with time zones, this raid was skipped and the next story mode began immediately. This means if you made a guide or plan to grind out the boss drops, those plans were null and void. NA players had permanently missed out on this portion of FGO history. The compensation was a measly 10 Saint Quartz, enough for just over 3 pulls. I understand that developers can sometimes mess up. That's fine. What I look for in that case is how they respond to that mistake. I know FGO's had its generous moments, but the way the game's maintenance is handled is pretty questionable. During the 7th NA anniversary, there were quite a number of times when the service unexpectedly went offline. I'm sure a lot of players will say, well, they compensated players for the maintenance, so there shouldn't be any problems. But think about the inconveniences this may have caused, about the players that may have had limited time in their day to play, or that they were doing something important, but suddenly gets cut off from playing. In recent times, I've never heard of a top gacha game ever having this problem. Now, let's try comparing this to a more competent development team. Quite a while ago, I completed Limbus Company's Chapter 5, which is also a turn-based visual novel-style gacha game. I gotta say, the story is pretty damn good. So first, I think FGO's got some competition in the story department. This is a game where the writers are extremely confident in the character designs, since there are only 12 characters in the main cast, and all units pulled in the gacha are different versions of the 12. Project Moon releases a main story chapter fully voiced every 4 months, with an interlude chapter in the middle of that 4 months wait time. The game is rich with lore, a very strong cast of characters, and bi-weekly updates for quality of life changes and new content. The difference of how this developer handles update schedules and feedback is night and day. The thing is, developer responsiveness is not hard to do. Communicate what you heard from the players, what you're working on, and a rough schedule for when these problems will be fixed. FGO is the first game I've reviewed from a Japanese developer, and historically Japan tends to be a more traditional and reserved culture. However, this doesn't have to be the norm, because you can so easily go above and beyond if you do it right. For example, Konami, currently developing the remake for Metal Gear Solid 3, released a conference of the producers of the project discussing the fans' feedback. They were willing to show all the comments, both positive and negative. This was a bold move, but it also won back a lot of player goodwill after their treatment of the Metal Gear Solid franchise before. Even then, being reserved doesn't make someone incompetent. If you don't have any transparency with players, you are still expected to roll out content updates in a reasonable schedule. If you say nothing, that will still cause people to doubt you. It's not something that's out of the realm of possibilities. They have the budget to do it. Earlier this year, they did the first servant animation updates after 2 years, revamping the animations of the 2 SSR Jean versions to make them appear more fluid in gameplay. There's even a unique attack animation if you attack Jill as Jean. That's a really nifty way to add attention to detail. They didn't have to do this, but they did. During the 7th anniversary, the gameplay system also added a buff to quick chains and adding the Mighty Chain, which both shake up the game in a major way. So I know Lasengle is capable of doing these improvements if they really set their mind to it. Keep doing those animation updates, just like how they've done in the past. I'm sure a lot of players would like to see the end of the infamous caster balls. What about Leonidas? His MP animation is just literally standing there against a black background. So I mentioned this in the previous video, but it pays to be stingy. If players are willing to give a developer a pass despite not being treated too well, that is the perfect scenario to be in. This is because when the developer eventually does something that's minutely good, they get praise like the second coming of Christ. Look at the overwhelming amount of praise when the genre animation updates happen. I guess Lasengle is the good guys after all. I guess they do care about us. Now, I'm sure the game has had its moments, like the pity system, alongside full-screen cutscenes and optimization brought to the NA servers early, so I do want to give them credit that not all of it is bad. I know some people could argue, well, FGO has been improving in its own way. But if you watch the entirety of this review, I am not judging FGO by how much it's improved by its own metrics. This display of artificially prolonging events, a snail's pace schedule for main story chapters, and dead periods vastly outnumbering the times when the game undergoes drastic change. So I'm granting them the below expectations rating once again. To be honest, this section would have been even longer, but I don't see the point of beating a dead horse. I haven't even talked about the lack of content this year as well. There were 2 reruns back-to-back for a total of 6 weeks, so for roughly 2 months, there was no significant new content. For the record, I don't consider events quests or interludes as events, since it's a basic expectation that challenge content is rolled out periodically, much like how the majority of gacha games just release them as monthly or bi-weekly editions. They are not events. Now, this portion of the video was appended on the very last day before the video was uploaded. And after seeing the announcements of the 9th anniversary, I just gotta say, yikes. There were no major quality of life changes, and the addition of the 2 new append skills are another way to artificially add grind while requiring players to pull even more copies of the unit. However, the reason this video was delayed for a day is that after the JP player base did some convincing on Twitter, against all odds, Lasengle actually issued a response within 24 hours. You can now transfer one append skill to another, so while this still doesn't change the fact that you have to pull 8 or more copies of an SSR to max everything out, it is at least something. Not to mention, all coins spent on grill casting will be refunded. I need to emphasize this part because Lasengle responding to the player base at all is extremely unprecedented. This must have struck a nerve so hard that it forced their hand. As many pointed out, this is not nearly enough to address the piss-poor implementation of servant coins, and it does not change my perception of Lasengle as a company. It comes down to whether the big spenders are okay with this as the minimal amount of improvements. Remember, with a lot of these larger corporations, you give an inch, they take a mile. But hey, we'll see if 120 quartz is all it takes to shut the players up. The Fate universe is vast, possibly one of the largest Japanese intellectual properties out there. One cannot deny their cultural significance, as well as the quality of its story and character designs. At its core, FGO's gameplay loop is fine, simplistic on the surface but with layers of complexity under the hood. I think in terms of freedoms and builds or strategy, the game allows servants from all varieties to shine. For a game that has held steady for 9 years, I would say it still speaks a lot about its staying power and the dedication of its fanbase. I tend to go a bit easier on older games, since I know they never had the foresight of modernizing it to the current market. That being said, FGO has had a lot of opportunities to improve its mechanics and make changes. Now, I'll tell you the one argument I hate when any defense regarding live service games show up. You can't criticize the game because the devs will fix these problems in the future. My response to this will be the same every time. I can't predict the future. Neither can you. I will review the product in front of me right now. Regardless if anything gets fixed in the near future, the problems I have stated in this video have been affecting the game for the better part of 7 years. I actually started on the script for this video by early May. The reason this wasn't put out sooner is because I wanted to wait until the announcements of the 9th anniversary to make sure that people can't make this argument. So for anything listed in the video, they are still valid criticisms. I've seen the anniversary announcements. I know it, you know it. And who knows, part of me really believed they fixed some of the game's problems, but hey, maybe 10th time's the charm. I've stuck with FGO for more than 2 years, and I believe being a fan of something is not to blindly defend it, but to critique it so that it may become better. For those in denial of the state that the game is in, despite going into the modern gacha market, let me ask you. Does having a laughable pity system, poor developer responsiveness, and a lack of quick farm features give FGO its own unique identity? Is a part of the game's creative vision to leave out crucial skill descriptions in-game and mislead players through the UI? The weird part is, FGO is the one true anomaly in the gacha industry. Despite everything that has happened, the game remains to have an extremely loyal and dedicated community. If another dev tried to do things at the pace of FGO, the game would fail. Delightworks has literally tried that, and the game shut down in 6 months. You've seen the rating on the thumbnail. I cannot deny that the backbones of the story is supported by industry veterans, and when it shines, it absolutely deserves to be praised. But the game is hugely marred by a mismanaged development team, because part of me wanted to bump down the rating even more after seeing the dismal 9th anniversary announcements. I personally believe complacency and mediocrity should not be rewarded, and this company right here is one huge pile of it. All I have to say when seeing the status of this game is, after 2 long years, I'm finally out. With these final words, I want to restate that a review is ultimately an informed opinion. You are allowed to disagree with me on any points in the video. I know that FGO, and by extension the Type Moon franchise, has a long-standing fanbase. I know there are a lot of people passionate about this game. I do not want you to stop having fun with this game. What I want to do is to point out the good and the flaws, and push the development team to make the game better. Asking someone to play a gacha game for 2 years is a very long time. I stuck with the game throughout my journey because I was engrossed in the lore and the story of the Fate universe. Truth be told, I will likely pick up Tsukihime and Mahoyo down the line as well. They're both genuinely amazing stories by some of the best writers on the other side of the world. With that said, I appreciate your time being here today. You're free to leave behind any feedback or criticisms of this video down below. If you enjoyed the video and want more gacha content just like this one, you know what to do. Thanks for watching, and as always, have fun out there.